Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I've listened over the last several weeks to accusations and a type of a smear campaign, quite frankly, against a good judge and a good man, Neil Gorsuch. It's remarkable to me to see that the debate has become more about character destruction than it has been about policy differences. I understand that there are policy differences. Why does it have to become to this? In the past few weeks, I've heard on this floor that Neil Gorsuch shouldn't be a justice on the Supreme Court because he has no independence from President Trump. Number two, I've heard he was handpicked by far-right groups like the Federalist Society, a group of legal minds committed to the original interpretation of the Constitution. Clearly, a scandalous group of radicals. I've heard that Judge Gorsuch supports torture. He's against privacy. He hates truckers. He'll step on the little guy, and he'll only help big corporations, and he's just not mainstream. And I've heard that he shouldn't be selected because he was not approved first by the Democratic Senate leadership. All of these reasons have been given for a historic change in Senate tradition, not to give a Supreme Court justice an up or down vote, block him on a procedural motion. For the first time ever, block a Supreme Court justice on a procedural motion with a partisan vote. So let me take these just one at a time as I walk through this. Number one, I heard constantly, he's not independent enough from President Trump. Now, as far as I know, he had never even met President Trump before. This doesn't seem to be a standard to be independent from the current sitting president. Let me give you an example of this. Justice Elena Kagan, clearly qualified as a legal mind, but I would tell you Republicans have serious policy differences with her, though Justice Kagan was allowed to be able to have an up or down vote. This body did not have a standard that they have to be independent from the president. If they would have had a standard like that, Justice Kagan would never be on the bench. Why do I say that? Well, on May the 10th, 2010, President Obama nominated Elena Kagan to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. From 1997 to 1999, she served as the Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy and Deputy Director for Domestic Policy Council for President Clinton. In 2009, she was confirmed Solicitor General of the United States for President Obama. She worked for President Obama in the Obama White House as his Solicitor General, and then was taken directly out of the White House and put onto the Supreme Court. I would say that's not independent from the president. So this mythological new standard that any court justice nominee needs to be independent from the president clearly wasn't in place when Elena Kagan was being heard. It's also interesting to me that one of the most talked about decisions from Judge Gorsuch was a Chevron decision that he put out. The whole crux of that decision was the independence of the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Let me just read a few paragraphs from that decision that he wrote. He wrote this: "For whatever the agency may be doing under Chevron, the problem remains that courts are not fulfilling their duty to interpret the law and declare invalid agency actions inconsistent with those interpretations in the cases and controversies that come before them. A duty expressly assigned to them by the APA, that's the Administrative Procedures Act, and one often likely compelled by the Constitution itself. That's a problem for the judiciary. And it's a problem for the people whose liberties may now be impaired not by an independent decision maker seeking to declare the law's meaning as fairly as possible, the decision maker promised to them by law, but by an avowedly politicized administrative agent seeking to pursue whatever policy whim may rule the day. Those problems remain uncured by this line of reply." In other words, the judiciary needs to have oversight of the executive agency in what they put out as far as agency rulings, not allowing the White House or any agency to just make any decision they like. He continued writing, "Maybe it's troubling. This line of reply invites a nest of questions, even taken on its own terms. Chevron says that we should infer from any statutory ambiguity Congress's intent to delegate its legislative authority to the executive and to make reasonable policy choices. But where exactly has Congress expressed this intent? Trying to infer the intentions of an institution composed of 535 members is a notoriously doubtful business. In his statement and all the accusations that he's not independent of the president, in one of his most famous opinions, he declares that we absolutely need to have independence from the White House, of any White House, and have a clear separation of powers between judiciary, legislative, and executive. That absolutely just does not stand up to just simple muster. So the first thing falls. No independence from the president. Second issue that came up often was he was handpicked by far-right groups. There were all these groups that handpicked him, and so somehow that made it horrible that these different groups would actually try to support him. Well, it's interesting. I go back again to Justice Kagan. That wasn't the standard at that time again, and I could use numerous judges through that process. Elena Kagan was supported by the AFL-CIO, by the Human Rights Campaign, by numerous environmental groups like Wild Earth Guardians and Sierra Club, National Organization for Women. She had a lot of different liberal or progressive groups that were very outspoken in support in helping push her nomination. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. She was a nominee that was actively engaged in White House politics. She was actively engaged in Democratic campaigns before that, as far back as working for the Dukakis campaign. She was a Democratic activist, and it was well known. That did not preclude her from getting an up or down vote for the Supreme Court, because she is sitting on the Supreme Court today. There was no cloture vote mandate or requirement for a 60-vote threshold, as there was pushed by this minority. This issue of somehow you can be handpicked, or that you would have some groups that would support you from the outside, that somehow precludes you from being a serious consideration, is not legitimate, and everyone knows it. I've also heard the individuals out there saying, he's for torture. He's against privacy. He hates truckers. He'll step on the little guy. He's only for big corporations. He's not mainstream. Here's the problem. When you actually look at the history, it comes very different than that. Of the 2,700 cases that Judge Gorsuch has been involved in, the 10 and a half years he's been on the 10th Circuit, he's been overturned with his opinions once. Once. In 2,700 cases. 97% of the time, his cases were settled unanimously. 99% of the time, he voted with the majority. And unless you don't know the 10th Circuit, like we know the 10th Circuit in Oklahoma, because they are the circuit court for our state, the majority of the judges on the 10th Circuit are judges selected by President Carter, President Clinton, and President Obama. They hold the majority in the 10th Circuit. So to say that he voted with them in the majority 99% of the time would be to say that the Carter, Clinton, Obama appointees also apparently had these radical ideas. It's just not consistent with the facts. And then I've heard of late that the president should have engaged with Senate leadership on both sides of the aisle to be asked approval of the nominee before that nominee was ever brought. Well, I don't know that that's ever been a requirement. There have been times that presidents in the past have had conversations with people on both sides of the aisle. Fine. But it's certainly not a requirement from the Constitution, and it certainly doesn't preclude. It is interesting to me that Judge Gorsuch came and offered to meet with 100 senators one-on-one, face-to-face. Only 80 of them accepted his offer. 20 of them refused to even meet with him face-to-face. He did 4 days of hearings, though, in the Judiciary Committee. 4 solid, long days, where he answered every possible question he could answer. He's had extensive background checks. Everyone's gone through every piece of everything they can find that's ever been written. In fact, the latest new accusation is they found a couple of places where what he wrote seemed to look strangely like something else someone else wrote. which when I saw it and read the side-by-side on it, I thought, he forgot to do an annotation and a footnote in the 800 opinions that he's written and the tens of thousands of annotations that he did. He didn't do a couple of them. Somehow that doesn't seem to rise to the level of he shouldn't be on the Supreme Court in the tens of thousands of annotations that he put there that he might have missed a couple. I would challenge anyone serving in this body to say you could only serve if you never missed a single footnote on any paper you ever wrote. I would say who lives in glass houses probably shouldn't throw stones, because we've all had times like that. He's a solid jurist. I believe he'll do a good job. And in the time I sat down in his office and we looked at each other face to face, and I went through multitudes of hard questions with him, trying to determine his judicial philosophy, seeking one simple thing. Will you interpret the law as the law? Not with personal opinion, but as the law. This body is about opinions. This body is about listening to the voices all across our states and trying to make good policy. Across the street at the Supreme Court, it's about one thing. What does the law say, and what did it mean when it was written? Constitution and laws are not living documents. Now, they do live in the sense that if you want to have changes in the Constitution, you amend the Constitution and you make changes to it. But you can't suddenly say it meant one thing one day, but culture has changed and now it means something new. If you need new law, this body passes new law. Across the street, they read the law and just say, what does it mean? It's that straightforward. And I look forward to having a jurist on the Supreme Court as an associate justice that says, I may not even like all my opinions, and you may not like all my opinions, but I'm going to follow the law. And what the law says, that's what we're going to do. I think that's the best that we could ask from a Supreme Court justice. And I think it's a fair way to be able to get him an up or down vote. And I have to tell you, I'm profoundly disappointed that the Senate, to get a simple up or down vote, had to go through all of this just to be able to do what we've always done. Regardless of background or preferences or policy or politics, this body has always said the president, for his nomination, should get an up or down vote when they go through the process. We're going to do that tomorrow. And we'll put Judge Gorsuch on the bench. And we're ready for him to go to work. With that, Mr. President, I yield back.